Hey. So welcome, Phil. Thanks for popping in on the way to Australia.
Hi, Chris. Good to be in London.
Once again, yes.
Chilly.
Chilly and cold. Tell us a little bit, first of all, about your background, just very briefly. I know you've been working in this area for 30 years or something like that.
It is around 30 years. Started working in this field in the 1980s.
Yeah.
It was 1989.
Yeah. Working with Alan Walker, I think.
Working with Alan Walker at Sheffield University on research to do with older workers. It was really about the research came out of economic growth and the idea that we were needing to deal with population ageing and economic growth and what was going to happen to industry. And the irony was that then we lurched into a recession as this project was happening. And so that rather changed the focus somewhat. But nonetheless, it was part of a movement, a momentum around looking at engaging older workers rather than divesting oneself of older workers, which had been the history of the 1980s.
Yeah, okay, so using the economic potential of the older workforce and so forth. Where did the term age management come from, Phil?
That's a good question. To my recollection, it came from the Nordic countries, I think Finland. But age management has been around as a topic for a long time.
Yeah.
I think for me, the issue is it's come to be viewed as being to do with older workers. And I often say nowadays at events I'm asked to speak at, when people start talking about older workers, what's an older worker?
Mm-hmm.
And for me, there's a real problem here and it's not just nuances of terminology. It's actually a problem in the sense that when people talk about older workers, it's hard to define an older worker.
Yeah.
Because as we know, as you know, older workers are very diverse. So when public policymakers and advocates start talking about policy for older people, my immediate retort is, well, what do you mean? Because older people are very diverse. And so to say that we're going to develop a program for older workers, it seems to me you're almost inevitably going to run into problems of a group that has relatively little in common. I mean, I often say at events nowadays, and I know you're familiar with this stuff, that a 50-year-old has much more in common with a 40-year-old probably than they do with a 75-year-old. So what's this thing that's an older worker? And I think it's a fundamental problem. So age management has come to be associated with older people, whatever an older person is. But I think age management really needs to be broadened out as an idea to think about workers of all ages.
Yeah, and when you hear people from Finland seem to be in the lucky position of coming from a country where they've done things differently and so forth. But when you hear people talking about some of the work that's been done there, you get some sense that there are a few core ideas that it's possible to sort of take away, and maybe they are transferable relatively easily from one country to another. What would you say those ideas are?
Well, I think for me, the fundamental thing that comes out of Finland, and drawing on that concept of workability that I know you're familiar with, is a holistic view of these issues. That it's not just a matter of...
You've got to take it all together.
Absolutely.
What do you have to join up then?
You have to join up. You have to join ideas up. You have to think about the workplace. You have to think about public policy. You need to think about the individual, and you can't develop policy in one sphere alone and expect to have impact. I think for me, increasingly, when I think about age management, I think about workers of all ages, and why do I do that? Because we've done work looking at the future of work and the impact it will have on older workers, and tomorrow's older workers I'm talking about here. Those workers who are presently aged in their 30s and 40s. And so when I think about the issue now, increasingly, I think about people for whom working life is transforming. It's changing quite dramatically around them. and many are finding themselves in more precarious employment situations, casualised work. Their jobs may be under threat from digital technologies and robotics. And I'm thinking about their retirement and their relationship with the labour market going forward. And so I think that when we're developing policy for older workers, we have a tendency to think about today's older workers, but I think we need to be focusing increasingly on tomorrow's older workers. And I think that's a challenge for, certainly in Australia, where I do most of my work nowadays, it's a challenge for advocacy, because most of the advocacy for older workers comes from old age advocacy or advocacy organisations that focus on people aged over 60, say.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to get across to them the need to really think about tomorrow, because we're talking about, I think, a radically different set of circumstances.
Yeah. So what do you think are the good takeaways from Australia, say, or maybe even parts of Asia, where I know that you've been working as well, in relation in particular to public policy, but employers' policy and the role of the trade unions in this whole area?
Well, I'm not going to say that Australia is far advanced compared with Europe. I'm certainly not going to say that. I would say there are parts of Asia, including Australia, where the policy imperatives are manifest, they're obvious, and we know those countries. Japan is facing major issues due to its demography and is countenancing immigration, for instance, where it's never countenanced immigration before. Singapore, the same. It's facing major demographic transformation. Korea, if one looks at Korea, it will need to do a lot to maintain its present level of economic growth, because it as with Japan, as with Singapore, is facing major labour shortfalls. It may tell us something about South Korea's rapprochement with the North. Labour. It needs workers. China, I think, is a major issue. And I know, spending time in China a lot, and including recently, there is a considerable concern in China about what its changing demography will mean for its economic growth. And the Chinese are talking about remarkable numbers of older people by 2050. So what's happening in Australia, I think there's Australia is a conundrum in many senses. There has been quite a lot of activity in this space. I think advocacy is muddled, and I say this quite often at public events I'm asked to speak at. So we have, for instance, I think our approach to advocating for older people has, I say it's been muddled. So we are told, we have an age discrimination commissioner, and we're into our second age discrimination commission now, and that position was established several years ago. My problem with advocacy in Australia is that I think it is wont to be ageist itself. And I think the takeaway for me, and I think a lesson that we all need to learn as advocates for older people, is not to challenge ageism with ageism. And so we see a lot of ageism in pronouncements in Australia, including from our age discrimination commissioner.
Using stereotypes to fight stereotypes.
So using stereotypes to fight stereotypes. So we're told, for instance, that older workers are more reliable and they're more loyal, and there are problems with that, both in terms of stereotyping older people, but also making inferences about younger people being unreliable and not being loyal. And when we talk about age discrimination in Australia, what's interesting for me is that it's often being couched in terms of older people and age discrimination. So we don't think about age discrimination and other age groups. And I think for me that's a fundamental problem in tackling these issues. We need to address age discrimination across the board.
Okay, so leaving aside advocacy per se, which obviously is important, what are employers and unions and public authorities and anyone else that you can think of doing that is really useful, the kind of pearls of wisdom